You should know your place. Tables like this aren't for people like you." The words, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the elegant hum of the ballroom. The music seemed to stutter. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. 100 pairs of eyes, glittering with diamonds and disdain, turned as one. The very air grew thick, heavy with a silence that was louder than any symphony. And then came the laugh. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was a weapon, high-pitched and cruel, forged in generations of unearned privilege and designed to inflict a wound. Isabel Sterling, heiress to a dynasty built on steel and shadows, leaned over her chair. She was a vision in a dress of liquid silver, a garment that seemed to mock the very light it reflected. A smile that held no warmth, only the cold promise of cruelty, twisted her perfect lips. In her hand, a crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux glittered like a captured star. Without a flicker of hesitation, she inverted it. A torrent of deep red wine, the color of blood and old money, cascaded downward. It caught the 1,000-faceted light of the Zenith Tower's grand chandelier, a grotesque waterfall of crimson, before it met its target. The liquid crashed into the immaculate hair of the woman seated below, soaking the elegant chignon, flowing across her scalp in sticky rivulets. It dripped past her temples, traced a path down her jaw, and streamed onto her emerald green dress, blooming into dark, ugly stains that destroyed the fabric's perfect sheen. The sound of the wine hitting her, soaking her, was unnaturally loud in the sudden, absolute vacuum of the room. It was a wet, violating sound that made people flinch. A few scattered gasps erupted, sharp and sudden. Muffled, nervous laughter sputtered from a table of young men who saw cruelty as a spectator sport. And, inevitably, the phones rose. An army of glowing rectangles, their cameras hungry for scandal, their lenses desperate to capture and consume another's humiliation. The wife of a prominent surgeon covered her mouth with a horrified hand, her eyes wide. A group of trust fund heirs in bespoke suits leaned back, grins spreading across their faces as if they'd just been served the evening's finest entertainment. Isabel Sterling threw her head back, her silver dress shimmering, and laughed again. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. She was basking in the attention, drinking it in. "There, that's much better," she declared, her voice carrying like a trumpet call across the silent hall. "Green was never your color, darling. Red suits you so much more." She dangled the now empty glass from her fingertips, tilting it back and forth as if it were a newly won trophy. Some of the guests, eager to align themselves with power, laughed on cue. Others offered a smattering of polite, timid applause. The message was brutally clear, understood by everyone in that room. This was a dominance play. This was a public execution of dignity. But the woman in the emerald dress, the black CEO, Serafina Vance, did not move. She didn't flinch as the wine dripped into the collar of her ruined gown. She didn't wipe the sticky liquid that was beginning to dry on her skin. She simply sat, motionless, her hands resting on the table, perfectly composed. It was a stillness so profound, it felt like a form of defiance, a calm so absolute, it was unnerving. Her eyes, which had been cast downward, slowly lifted. It was not the panicked glance of a victim, not a desperate plea for help. It was a slow, deliberate, calculated ascension. Her gaze moved past the stained tablecloth, past the shocked faces of the other guests, and locked onto Isabel Sterling with a quiet, terrifying force. The laughter in the room began to falter. One by one, the sycophantic chuckles died, strangled in the throat. The ripple of noise collapsed back into a suffocating silence. Isabel shifted slightly, her triumphant smirk tightening at the edges. She tried to force another giggle, tossing her platinum blonde hair in a practiced gesture of nonchalance, playing for the audience she felt was still hers. "Come on, don't be shy. Give the cameras a little smile," she taunted, gesturing with the empty glass toward the sea of glowing phones still aimed at their table. But even she could feel it. The current was turning. The spectacle was no longer hers to command. The soaked woman in green didn't need words. Her stillness was heavier than any shout, more powerful than any outburst of outrage. Every drop of wine that fell from her chin to the pristine white linen was an unspoken declaration. Every second of silence that stretched on built a pressure in the room that Isabel's laughter could no longer pierce. The grand ballroom itself, with its gilded ceilings and crystal fixtures, seemed to bend around Serafina's composure. The chandelier still sparkled, but the spotlight had moved. The woman dripping with wine was no longer the object of ridicule. She was becoming something else, something unshakable, a center of gravity that every gaze, every thought, every whispered fear now circled. Before we dive deeper into this moment, I have to ask, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of dignity over disrespect, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this deserve to be told, and we're so glad you're here to be a part of it. Now, back to the silent storm that was Serafina Vance. The hush didn't last. It couldn't. The tension was too thick. Whispers began to coil through the room like venomous smoke. A woman dripping in diamonds leaned toward her husband, her hand shielding her mouth as she muttered, "Did you see that?" She just sat there, not a tear. Another man, a rival developer, chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "She won't last 5 minutes in this circle, not with that kind of passivity." But not all the whispers carried scorn. From the far end of the long table, a veteran investor frowned, his eyes narrowing at Isabel's gleeful performance. A quiet murmur reached his neighbor. "Too far. That was too far." His words were barely audible over the click of a phone's camera shutter. And the phones, oh, they were everywhere. A dozen different angles captured the wine still seeping from Serafina's dress, each frame destined for social media feeds and gossip columns before the dessert course was even served. Some held their screens high, their faces bathed in the cold light of vicarious drama. Others tried to be more discreet, pretending to check their messages while their lenses burned the humiliation into digital memory. The laughter started again, not from everyone, but from a specific, predictable corner. The young heirs, the ones who had never worked a day in their lives, clapped each other on the back. One of them, his eyes bright with a casual cruelty, leaned over to his friend. "She should be grateful. That Bordeaux costs more than her entire outfit, I'd wager." Their laughter was loud, braying, and designed to fill the void left by Serafina's refusal to react. A woman in pearls smirked as she adjusted the napkin in her lap. "Isabel is right. She doesn't belong here. Look at her. She can't even defend herself." Isabel, hearing these murmurs of support, lifted her empty glass once more, as if conducting an orchestra of derision. She curtsied mockingly toward the still figure in green, basking in what she perceived as a wave of validation. "A toast. To outsiders," she announced with a sneer. More laughter, more forced applause, more clinking of glasses. Yet beneath the cacophony of cruelty, a different kind of tension was stirring. Not everyone was laughing. A pair of senior partners from a major investment firm whispered frantically behind their menus, concern etched onto their faces. "She's the CEO of Vantage Solutions, isn't she? The one Sterling's brother just signed the partnership with this morning?" The other nodded grimly, his eyes darting toward the woman drenched in wine. Their amusement had curdled into deep, stomach-churning worry. They knew what was at stake, even if the giddy, silver-clad heiress did not. Meanwhile, Serafina remained motionless. She did not wipe the wine pooling at her collarbone. She did not rise to her feet to issue a challenge. Her silence became its own performance, a perfect, polished mirror in which every jeering voice, every cruel laugh was forced to see its own ugly reflection. The louder the crowd became, the more her profound composure magnified their barbarism. One young guest, who had been recording with glee just moments before, slowly lowered his phone. He felt a sudden, uncomfortable heat in his cheeks. He slipped the device into his pocket and stared intently at his water glass instead. A woman beside him frowned, her own laughter faltering as she watched the still, wine-soaked but unbroken figure. Something about the scene no longer felt amusing. It felt dangerous, as if the entire gilded room was holding its breath, waiting for an inevitable catastrophic turn. Isabel, gloriously oblivious, blew a kiss toward her audience of cameras. "Remember this night!" she shouted, spinning theatrically in her silver dress. "This is what happens when you sit where you don't belong!" Her laughter burst forth again, high and wild, echoing off the marble columns and into every corner of the opulent hall. But in the quiet spaces beneath that laughter, in the charged pauses between the gasps and the claps, eyes began to shift. The balance of power was changing. Not everyone was laughing anymore. Not everyone was blind to the reckoning that was about to come. And at the center of it all, wine dripping steadily onto the marble floor, Serafina Vance waited. Her gaze never wavered. The wine dripped from a strand of her hair, slid past her cheekbone, and vanished into the stained folds of her emerald dress. Still, she sat with a spine straight as steel, her hands resting lightly on the table as if nothing had happened at all. Around her the room hummed with a nervous, crackling energy, laughter that was pitched too high, whispers that were too sharp, the clinking of glasses used to mask a growing unease. But when her eyes lifted again, all that noise seemed to dim. She looked first at the empty glass in Isabel's hand, the weapon that had been turned into a trophy. Then she raised her gaze higher, letting it settle on the heiress's face. The smug, self-satisfied smirk on Isabel's lips faltered. It was only for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible flicker, but in that moment of absolute silence, the crowd caught it. Serafina's stare was deliberate, unhurried, and piercing. She didn't need to speak. Her silence wrapped around her like a suit of armor, and the sheer weight of it pressed down on the entire room. Her composure was now the loudest thing in the hall. A ripple of profound discomfort spread through the guests. One man shifted in his seat, suddenly and acutely aware of how loud and foolish his laughter had sounded just a moment ago. Another woman lowered her phone, a flush of shame rising on her neck for having been caught recording such a cruel act. The cameras were still pointed, but their owners were no longer so certain they wanted proof of what they were witnessing. Isabel tossed her hair, forcing a brittle, fragile laugh. "What? No comeback? Cat got your tongue?" she sneered, but her voice cracked slightly at the edges. She leaned closer, waving the glass in a gesture of mock triumph. "You should thank me. No stylist in the world could make you stand out like this." Her cruelty was a physical thing, a wave of malice that radiated from her, but it met only the unbreachable wall of Serafina's silence. And then, slowly, Serafina blinked. It was a single, measured blink, her lashes heavy with wine. When her eyes opened again, they were calm, cold, and utterly unflinching. It was the look of someone who had already seen the end of the game, someone who held the power to end the entire charade with a single thought. Isabel felt it. She took an involuntary step back, just a half step, but it was enough. The keen-eyed observers in the room noticed. Murmurs stirred. "Did you see that? She's not even angry," someone whispered. Another voice, filled with a new and dawning unease, replied, "No, she's waiting." "Oh." Serafina adjusted her posture slightly, straightening in her chair. She lifted one hand, not to wipe away the wine, but to place it gently on the stem of her own water glass. Her fingers curled around it with a quiet, unshakable certainty. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Her gaze never left Isabel. She let the silence stretch. A silence so thick and heavy it could drown the mocking giggles that tried and failed to spark back to life. The crowd, without realizing it, leaned in, drawn by the immense gravity of her stillness. And in that charged, breathless pause, something fundamentally shifted. The spectacle no longer belonged to the woman in silver. The spotlight had moved. Every eye was now on the drenched figure at the table, not as a victim, but as the calm, silent center of a storm that no one else could see coming. Isabel forced another laugh. Too loud, too hollow. She waved to the crowd as if trying to reclaim their attention, but her eyes flicked nervously back to the woman she had tried and failed to humiliate. And what she saw staring back at her was not weakness. It was a warning. The grand ballroom buzzed with attention so palpable you could almost taste it. Guests leaned closer to one another, their voices lowered, a network of unease spreading like fine cracks across a sheet of glass. The wine kept dripping. The silence kept deepening. And at the center of it all, Serafina Vance's eyes told a story that no one else dared to speak aloud. This isn't over. Isabel Sterling shifted her weight, the heels of her designer shoes clicking softly against the marble floor as she tried to reclaim the rhythm of the room. Her smile widened, but it was brittle at the edges now, the kind of desperate grin that dared the crowd to laugh with her or risk being seen as standing against her. She twirled the empty Bordeaux glass in her fingers, letting it dangle carelessly by her side. "Oops," she announced, her voice dripping with a mock innocence that fooled no one. "Guess I got a little carried away, but come on, look at her. She actually looks better this way, don't you think?" She gestured grandly toward Serafina, who remained seated, silent, dripping wine like a statue carved from pure resolve. A few obedient, nervous chuckles followed. A smattering of applause rose from her loyal inner circle, people whose fortunes were tied to her families, all of them desperate to keep her ego and their positions intact. One man even clapped too loudly, his forced laugh bouncing around the hall like broken glass. But beyond that shallow ring of sycophants, the atmosphere wavered. Guests exchanged wary, uncertain looks. A woman took a long sip of her champagne, her eyes wide with discomfort over the rim of her glass. An older gentleman meticulously adjusted his cufflinks, finding the pattern of the tablecloth suddenly more fascinating than the spectacle before him. Isabel tilted her head back, basking in what she tragically mistook for admiration. She raised her chin, her silver dress catching the light, diamonds at her ears flashing with every exaggerated theatrical gesture. She was undeniably beautiful, but her beauty had curdled into something sharp, arrogant, and ugly. She strutted around Serafina's chair like a predator circling its prey, her heels tapping out a sharp rhythm of disdain. "Tell me," she leaned in close, her expensive perfume warring with the sour scent of spilled wine, her tone dripping with venom. "How does it feel to sit among us? To wear your little emerald dress and pretend you belong? Did you really think no one would notice you're an imposter?" The room held its breath. Every syllable was a calculated strike. Every pause was a fresh insult. Isabel wanted to break her target, not just with wine, but with words. To strip away her dignity, layer by painful layer, until nothing remained but raw, exposed shame. And then she laughed again, louder, shriller, turning her head toward the crowd. "Don't be shy, everyone. Take a good look. This is what happens when you climb too high too fast." Phones flashed. Glasses clinked. But the energy was thinner now, stretched taut and ready to snap. Even those who were still laughing felt the unease churning beneath their own voices, the nagging, persistent thought that the joke had gone too far. Serafina Vance remained immovable. Her silence was beginning to feel less like passivity and more like a gathering storm on the horizon. She did not speak, but her presence spoke volumes. Her gaze followed Isabel with calm, unnerving precision, tracking her every exaggerated movement as though she were calmly measuring the cost of each and every insult. Isabel tried to hold that gaze but found herself glancing away, unable to withstand its silent, searing weight. She spun again, tossing her hair, twirling her empty glass in frantic circles. She leaned into her role as the villain, convinced that a powerful enough performance could erase the tremor of doubt that was beginning to creep into her chest. "Smile for the cameras," she sneered, lowering her voice just enough for those nearest to hear. "This will be the only headline you'll ever make." Her laughter spilled out once more, but it sounded different now. Thinner, more desperate, fighting against the heavy, disapproving silence that was pressing back from the woman she had tried to destroy. And across the table, across the hall, people began to see it. This cruel show was no longer amusing. It was unraveling. Isabel Sterling didn't know it yet, but the moment she poured that wine, she had lit a very long fuse. And the woman she had mocked was the one holding the match. The laughter spread again, though it was thinner this time, as forced and unpleasant as champagne that had gone flat. A handful of guests, eager to stay on the side of money and power, clapped their hands against the table, trying to keep the cruel mood alive. Their voices rose in shallow agreement. "That's right," one young man barked from the far end of the room, his diamond cufflinks catching the light as he raised his glass in a mock toast. "Outsiders should know their place." His words drew a ripple of uneasy, hesitant chuckles. Another guest, emboldened by the first, leaned back in his chair and spoke louder than he should have. "If she wants to play with the giants, she better learn how to take a joke." His friends laughed too loudly, a desperate attempt to prove they belonged to the same exclusive circle of cruelty. Isabel soaked it all up like a sponge. She turned to them, grinning, her arms spread wide as if she were the conductor of the entire room. "See? They understand," she declared, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She basked in the attention, twirling her glass like a scepter. "This is what happens when you forget where you came from." But cracks were forming in her wall of support. Not everyone was laughing. At the next table, a woman whispered sharply to her husband, "This is ugly, Robert. Truly ugly." He cleared his throat and glanced away, unwilling to meet her disapproving eyes. In another corner, the two investors exchanged another look, one heavy with unspoken calculations. One of them murmured, "She's the sole partner on the Vantage deal, isn't she?" The other gave the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. Both of them fell silent, staring down at their plates, unwilling to take any part in the unfolding farce. Yet the cruel chorus kept going. Phones hovered higher, their lenses recording everything. One guest angled his camera deliberately to frame Serafina's drenched figure, zooming in on the streaks of wine running down her skin. He chuckled softly to himself, already composing the witty, vicious captions he would post online. "Smile," someone shouted from across the hall. "Give us a good shot for the gram!" A roar of laughter followed, echoing off the marble columns, bouncing under the glittering chandelier. Isabel twirled once more, her silver dress swirling dramatically around her legs. She blew a kiss to the crowd, delighting in their mock applause. "Don't forget this night," she cried, raising her empty glass high. "It's the night an imposter finally got exposed." She bowed with theatrical exaggeration, reveling in her performance. The loyal ring of guests clapped harder, their laughter rising again, desperate to feed her ego and secure their own standing. But the energy was hollow now, sustained by habit more than any genuine joy. And in the center of it all, Serafina Vance still sat in silence. Her stillness only magnified the cruelty around her, reflecting every laugh and every jeer back onto those who gave it voice. One guest noticed. He lowered his phone slowly, the screen going dark, and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his eyes flicking guiltily toward the floor. A woman near him stopped laughing mid-breath, covering her mouth as if she were suddenly ashamed of the sound she had just made. The balance in the room was shifting, subtly but undeniably. Isabel, too intoxicated by her own bravado, didn't see it. She bowed again, her platinum hair cascading over her shoulders, her laughter high and shrill. "This is who she is!" she shouted, pointing a dramatic finger at the soaked woman at the table. "And this is all she'll ever be!" The applause answered her, but it was softer this time, scattered, uncertain. The spell was breaking, yet Isabel only smiled wider, blind to the silence that was growing in the spaces between the laughs. She believed she was winning. She didn't know the floor beneath her feet was already beginning to crack. The wine dripped slower now, dark stains spreading like a disease across the beautiful emerald fabric. But Serafina Vance did not move. She sat anchored in her chair as though it were a throne, and the entire opulent hall had, against its will, become her court. Her silence was not surrender, it was calculation. In her mind, the scene replayed, but not the scene in the ballroom. She saw the sterile boardroom from that very morning, the smooth glide of a fountain pen as signatures scrolled across crisp, heavy papers. The final draft of the press release, ready but not yet published. And the numbers. The beautiful, powerful numbers that stretched into the billions. 3.2. A landmark partnership celebrated by both sides as unshakable. And now, less than 12 hours later, the sister of her so-called partner had turned that unshakable alliance into a public spectacle of humiliation. Isabel laughed again, tossing her hair, clinging desperately to the sound of her own arrogance. "What's wrong?" she mocked, leaning in so close that her cloying perfume clashed with the sour tang of the wine. "Cat got your tongue? I thought you powerful businesswomen always had something to say?" Serafina's eyes didn't flicker. She studied her tormentor with an unnerving, analytical calm, her gaze slow and deliberate. She wasn't looking at the spilled wine. She wasn't looking at the jeering crowd. She was looking at the arrogance itself, measuring it, weighing it, and deciding its final cost. "You think this is power?" Her thoughts whispered in the silent chambers of her mind. A glass of wine, a forced laugh, a crowd of sycophants eager to clap for cruelty. That's not power. That's a performance. Real power, she thought, doesn't need an audience. Real power changes the numbers that built this very room. Real power rewrites the contracts your family clings to like a life raft. The din of voices around her blurred into a dull, meaningless hum. Every insult, every laugh, every whispered comment merged into a single background noise. All she could hear clearly was the echo of her own resolve. She placed one hand flat on the table, steady, firm. The gesture was small, but it commanded attention. A few nearby guests glanced down, sensing a shift in the energy, but unable to name it. Her other hand moved with equal care, lifting the folded linen napkin from her lap. With painstaking slowness, she dabbed gently at her jaw, removing a single line of wine without haste. It was not a gesture of weakness or submission. It was a gesture of absolute control. Isabel smirked. "Finally, cleaning yourself up, are we? It's about time." Her words were loud, meant for the whole room to hear, but they stumbled and fell in the air, brittle and weak against the profound silence that followed Serafina's calm, deliberate movements. Inside Serafina's mind, the decision crystallized. Every insult, every laugh, every single drop of wine sliding down her skin was tallied, converted into a cold, hard calculation, and the sum was clear. $3.2 billion. Erased with a single word. Her eyes rose once more, meeting Isabel's gaze directly. It was not a glare, not even a look of defiance. It was a look of pure, unadulterated certainty, the kind of certainty that could unsettle even the most reckless and privileged of souls. Across the hall, a few guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. The gathering storm behind those eyes, the cold, hard inevitability of consequence. Isabel faltered again, just for a second. She raised her chin higher, trying to smother the seed of doubt with another laugh, but the crack in her facade had already appeared. And in the silence between them, Serafina Vance thought only one thing. "Your family believes they poured wine on me. They don't see that I'm about to pour billions out of their reach forever." The napkin slid back onto the table, folded with meticulous care, as though the dark red stain upon it meant nothing at all. Serafina Vance's hands returned to their still position on the table. Her gaze swept across the hall, not hurried, not seeking sympathy, but merely observing. Each guest felt the weight of her eyes as they passed over them. Some averted their faces, suddenly fascinated by their dinner plates. Others took a quick, nervous sip of champagne. The air grew dense, fragile, every small sound sharp and jarring against the silence she commanded. Isabel, tragically, mistook that quiet for victory. She strutted closer, her heels striking the marble with a deliberate, rhythmic click. "There it is," she announced loudly, turning to the crowd as if delivering a line from a stage play. The silence of someone who knows she doesn't belong. A few of her cronies clapped on cue. A nervous ripple of laughter followed, but Serafina remained utterly unbothered. Her stillness was no longer defensive. It was strategic. She reached for her phone, which had been lying face down on the table. The screen lit up her palm with a soft, ethereal glow. Her fingers moved with unhurried, terrifying precision, tapping once, twice. She then lifted it to her ear. The shift in the room was immediate and seismic. The crowd leaned in, a collective body moved by a single thread of curiosity. Isabel tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, look, she's calling for help. Maybe her driver can bring her a towel." Her words were sharp, but her voice was a little too quick, a little too eager to fill the suddenly charged space. Serafina's tone, when it came, was nothing like Isabel's shrill theatrics. It was calm. It was cold. Each syllable dropped like a piece of iron into the silence. "Terminate the contract," she said, "effective immediately." A hush fell over the room that was heavier, deeper, and more absolute than before. The hall seemed to contract, the very air pressing inward. Even the string quartet in the corner, which had been quietly waiting to resume, stumbled. A cellist's bow faltered against the strings, creating a single discordant note that hung in the air like a ghost. Conversations froze mid-whisper. Eyes widened. Glances darted from person to person. She ended the call without any flourish, placing the phone back beside her plate, as though it were nothing more than a dinner knife. Then she folded her hands once more, her posture steady, her eyes fixed forward. Isabel blinked, her laugh caught in her throat. What did she say?" she asked, forcing another chuckle that rang completely hollow. No one answered her. The crowd's focus had irrevocably shifted. They no longer looked at the woman in the shimmering silver dress. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror, were glued to the drenched figure at the table, the one who had spoken just 5 words, and in doing so had shifted the very foundations of the room. A man at the far end of the table pulled out his own phone, his fingers scrolling frantically through a financial news app. His face drained of all color. He nudged his neighbor, whispering urgently, his voice tight with panic. Another guest's screen lit up, displaying a breaking news alert from a market watch service. The whispers grew faster, sharper, like the frantic clicking of a stock ticker. "She can't mean the sterling deal. Not today's deal." Isabel's smile wavered, then cracked. She tried to wave her empty glass again, to command the attention that was slipping through her fingers like sand. "She's bluffing," she scoffed, but her eyes flickered, betraying a rising tide of doubt. Serafina said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any declaration could ever be. The immense weight of what she had just done began to settle across the grand hall, like ash after a volcanic eruption. Isabel laughed one more time, a sound that was too loud, too strained, too desperate. But fewer people joined in this time. Her performance was unraveling, and she was the only one who didn't seem to realize how completely and utterly she had lost control. At the center of it all, soaked in wine yet completely untouchable, Serafina Vance sat in perfect composure. Her silence was no longer just a statement. It was a verdict. The seconds stretched into an eternity, every eye in the room darting between the woman in emerald and the heiress in silver. The buzz of whispers grew into a low, anxious rumble as words collided, scattered, and rose again. Somewhere near the back, a phone chimed with a stock alert. Another followed, then another, a cascade of digital notifications confirming the disaster. The first man to check his screen went pale. "Oh my God," he muttered, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the initial reports. "It's real. She's pulling out. The entire deal is dead." His neighbor leaned over, his eyes widening in horror at the numbers flashing red across the display. One by one, screens lit up around the room like fireflies in a dark forest. Notifications of the terminated partnership spread like a digital plague. The contract, the investment, the billions, suddenly, irrevocably gone. The official headlines hadn't been written yet, but the financial tremors were already shaking the foundations of the hall. A woman clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white. She couldn't have... Her words trailed off into stunned disbelief. "She did," he whispered back, his own voice raw with shock. $3.2 billion, wiped clean, with a phone call. The string quartet had stopped playing altogether. Their bows hung frozen above the strings, the musicians waiting for a permission to continue that would never come. The only rhythm left in the room was the sound of Isabel's heels clicking frantically across the marble as she paced, her smile completely shattered, her face a mask of confusion and rising panic. "She's bluffing," she insisted, her voice louder now, laced with desperation. "This is a party trick, a little drama, that's all it is." Her laugh was high and shrill, but this time no one echoed it. Not a single person. Heads were bent over glowing screens instead. Conversation snapped back and forth like sparks from a live wire. "It's gone. The entire fund. Check the market futures. They're already plummeting. I just got the same alert from my broker. Do you understand what this means for her family?" Isabel spun toward the crowd, her arms outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Why are you all staring at your phones? She can't do this. My brother, our family, we control this city." But her voice no longer filled the room. It was swallowed by the terrible truth scrolling across every device, by the immense weight of the silence that was building around the soaked figure who had uttered just 5 words and undone an empire's worth of arrogance. Serafina Vance reached for her water glass. Not the empty wine glass that had been wielded like a weapon, but her own, still half full. She lifted it with a calm, unshaken hand, a hand that was steady despite the wine dripping down her sleeve. She raised it to her lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and then set it back down on the table with a soft, quiet grace. No announcement, no explanation, only composure. The hall erupted, not with laughter, not with applause, but with a storm of shocked whispers that felt louder than any cheer. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests leaned toward one another, frantically trying to piece together what had just unraveled before their very eyes. Some sat rigid, too stunned to move. Others were already scribbling notes on napkins, their minds racing, already thinking of the boardrooms and headlines that waited for them outside these gilded doors. Isabel's breathing quickened. She spun back toward the woman she had tried to humiliate, her silver dress clinging to her, as though even the fabric knew the fire had burned out. "You think you can scare me with this little game?" she demanded. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her completely. Serafina finally lifted her eyes again, as calm as ever, meeting her tormentor's gaze with the same unflinching steel. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The room itself answered for her, because everyone in that room now understood, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't theater. This was power. Real, terrifying, world-altering power. Isabel's laughter tried to rise one last time, a brittle, forced sound, but it broke apart before it could fill the room. The audience no longer belonged to her. The guests had shifted in their seats, their faces lit with the cold, unforgiving glow of their screens, their murmurs sharpened with a new and urgent tone. No one cared for her theatrics anymore. They cared for numbers, for markets, for the financial earthquake that was trembling beneath their very fortunes. One man near the head of the table, a hedge fund manager, barked into his phone, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "Sell! Sell it all now!" His words carried like a warning flare in the night, sparking more calls, more frantic whispers across the room. A woman in silk gripped her clutch so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She stared across the table at the drenched figure of Serafina and whispered, almost to herself, "She really did it." Isabel spun on her heels, her silver dress fanning out dramatically, as if movement alone could pull the spotlight back to her. "Don't listen to her!" she shouted, but her words rang hollow, swallowed by the rising storm of panic. "She can't. She doesn't have that kind of power. My brother, our family." But the crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. They had seen enough. They had heard enough. The profound silence of Serafina Vance had spoken far louder than her rival's shrill, desperate protests. Serafina, still seated, adjusted her posture with an effortless grace. She placed her hands flat against the linen of the tablecloth. Her fingers relaxed, her eyes scanning the hall as though she were surveying her own private domain. The dark stains on her emerald dress glistened in the chandelier light, but they no longer looked like marks of humiliation. They looked like battle scars. They looked like a crown painted in red. One guest dared to speak the truth aloud. "She owns the floor now." His voice was low, but heads around him nodded in solemn agreement. It was undeniable. Isabel's mask of arrogance finally cracked, then shattered. She turned back toward Serafina, her voice trembling beneath the weight of her fury. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she spat, her words brittle with a lifetime of entitlement. Do you know what family I come from?" Serafina lifted her gaze, unhurried. For the first time since the phone call, she spoke again. Her tone was calm, clear, and cut through the air like a surgeon's blade. "I don't need to know who you are," she said. "What matters is who you'll be after tonight." The line fell with the weight of a guillotine across the grand ballroom. Guests exhaled sharply. Some gasped. Others nodded slowly, as though they had been waiting for her to speak those very words. The statement was measured, not loud, yet it echoed with more force than Isabel's loudest screams. Isabel staggered a step back, clutching her empty glass so tightly it was a wonder it didn't break. Her eyes, wide with a fear she could no longer hide, betrayed her. She tried to laugh it off, to twirl again, but her movements were jerky and uncoordinated. The performance was over, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Serafina's silence returned, heavier and more potent than before. She had given them only one sentence, yet it was enough to fracture the entire night into a clear before and after. Around the room, guests whispered furiously, their voices weaving a new narrative, not of humiliation, but of a brutal, stunning reckoning. The wine on her skin glistened like firelight. The entire room seemed to unconsciously bow to her presence. And as she sat there, still as stone, Isabel Sterling finally realized something she had never believed possible. Her laughter, her name, her money had all lost their power. The heiress in the silver dress stood frozen, her chest rising and falling too fast, her smirk stretched thin and grotesque across trembling lips. Around her, the opulent banquet no longer resembled a celebration. It felt like a tribunal, and every eye had turned, not toward her, but toward the woman she had tried to drown in wine. Serafina Vance leaned back slightly in her chair. It was not the slouch of weariness, but the relaxed recline of a queen, perfectly comfortable on her throne. The wine stains, once intended as marks of ridicule, now clung to her dress like medals of defiance. Each drop that touched the marble floor below echoed louder than the forced laughter of minutes ago. The phones were still raised, but their purpose had changed. No longer were they recording mockery. The guests whispered into their devices, their lenses framing Serafina not as a victim, but as a force of nature, immortalizing the exact moment the balance of power in their world had irrevocably shifted. One man whispered to his wife, "We're watching history happen." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the drenched woman in emerald green. Isabel tried again, her voice cracking, too shrill, too frantic. "You all know my family, you all know my brother. We built this city, she can't erase us." But the room had moved on. A cluster of investors leaned their heads together, their hushed tones carrying across the silence. $3.2 billion, gone, in a single phone call." Another shook his head, awe and fear etched into his features. She didn't even raise her voice. The weight of those words settled heavily over the room. Some guests now looked at Isabel with a flicker of pity, others with open contempt, but none looked at her with the reverence she so desperately craved. Serafina lifted her water glass again. Slowly, deliberately, she took another sip. The motion was unhurried, a quiet act of defiance that declared she owned not just her own dignity, but the entire room itself. The simple act drowned out every one of Isabel's protests, every nervous laugh that tried to bubble up from her supporters. And then she set the glass down with a soft, final click against the table. That sound carried more authority than all of Isabel's shouting. Finally, Serafina spoke again. Her voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that carried further and deeper than any scream. "This room," she began, "celebrates wealth, power, and legacy. But you should know that those things aren't inherited in a glass of wine." Her words slid through the crowd like electricity. Heads tilted forward, listening, absorbing, phones recorded with renewed urgency. Isabel stiffened, her face flushing a deep, blotchy red that clashed horribly with her silver dress. Serafina continued, never raising her volume, yet each word struck harder than the last. Tonight, you tried to humiliate me. But what you've actually done is remind everyone here that true power is not about spectacle. It's about consequence. A silence heavier than marble settled over the hall. Guests sat motionless, waiting, watching, unwilling to miss a single breath of what would come next. Isabel clutched her empty glass like a shield. Her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately searching for someone, anyone, to rescue her from the silence that had turned so completely against her. But no one moved. All they saw now was the woman seated in emerald, drenched but unshaken. Her calm, powerful presence made the grand hall itself feel as if it had bent to her will. And in that silence, it became brutally clear. Isabel Sterling wasn't in control anymore. She was simply standing in the ruins of her own arrogance, while Serafina Vance sat, composed and unshakable, in the absolute center of power. The air in the grand ballroom felt charged, as if lightning had struck but the thunder had not yet rolled. The guests sat rigid, their breaths shallow, their gazes pinned to the woman in emerald who had, in the space of a few minutes, transformed humiliation into absolute dominance. Isabel's silver dress shimmered under the chandelier, but its brilliance no longer commanded the room. It clung to her like a shroud of desperation, the fabric of someone who had lost everything. She tried one last time, her voice trembling as she forced the words out. "This is nonsense! You can't just end contracts! Deals don't end like that! You think you can just walk in here and undo everything my family has built?" Serafina's eyes lifted slowly, her stare locking onto Isabel's with such calm finality that the younger woman faltered mid-sentence. The crowd leaned in, holding their collective breath. "Power," Serafina said, her voice soft but carrying an immense weight, "doesn't ask for permission." The sentence wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, but it landed with a force that crushed every last whisper in the room. The guests froze, their phone screens glowing faintly in their hands, capturing a line that would echo in boardrooms and on trading floors long after this night was over. Isabel's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she looked small. Her glass trembled in her hand, her laughter was gone, her arrogance had completely unraveled. From the far end of the table, an older man in a tailored suit muttered under his breath. "She's finished." Another leaned closer, replying grimly, "No, they're finished. All of them." The murmurs swelled again, but this time they carried a different tone entirely. Not mockery, not scorn. It was fear, respect, and a profound, unsettling awe. The tide had turned so completely that everyone in the room knew they were witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another. Serafina adjusted her posture, wine still dripping faintly from her dress, and rested her chin lightly against her hand. She didn't need to speak further. Her silence was now the verdict. Her composure was the sentence. Isabel stumbled a step back, her heel catching for a moment against the smooth marble. She looked around frantically for support, for the friends who had laughed with her, for the allies who had clapped at her cruelty. But their eyes refused to meet hers. They were all too busy looking at the woman she had tried and failed to shame. The woman who had, instead, revealed herself as untouchable. Even the string quartet, frozen in the corner, seemed to be waiting on Serafina's unspoken command to resume. The entire hall had realigned itself around her presence. Finally, Isabel slammed her empty glass down on a side table. The crystal cracked under the force, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. "This isn't over," she hissed, though her voice shook too much to be convincing. She spun away, her silver dress swirling like fire losing oxygen, and stormed toward the exit. But her departure was not a triumph. It was a retreat, a rout. Serafina did not rise. She didn't need to. She simply watched, her eyes steady, until the grand doors closed behind the woman in silver. The silence that followed was thick, absolute. And then, slowly, the whispers began again. Not about scandal, but about legacy, about power, about the billions of dollars shifted with a single phone call, about the woman who had endured humiliation, yet walked away as the only name that mattered. In that moment, the entire hall seemed to bow, not to the wealth that was inherited, but to the strength that was earned. The doors shut with a hollow, final thud, and the echo lingered like the last note of a requiem. Isabel Sterling was gone, but the weight of her arrogance still hung in the air, now stripped bare and pathetic for all to see. What had begun as a spectacle had ended as a silence that belonged entirely to the woman still seated at the center of the hall. Serafina Vance lifted her water glass one final time. The chandelier's glow danced across its rim, and for a heartbeat, the crowd saw not the stains on her dress, not the wine dripping faintly to the marble, but the unshakable poise of a leader who had turned mockery into mastery. She took a slow, deliberate sip, set the glass down with finality, and looked around the room. One by one, eyes dropped before hers. Phones were lowered. Whispers died. No one dared to laugh now. No one dared to sneer. The guests who had eagerly joined in the cruelty earlier now sat rigid, shame pooling in their silence. Others, those who had watched with a quiet unease, now leaned forward with a respect they could no longer disguise. She spoke, her voice steady, low, carrying with ease through the cavernous hall. "Dignity," she said, "doesn't vanish when wine is poured on it. It doesn't shatter under the weight of laughter. Dignity endures. And tonight, every person in this room learned who truly holds it." The words settled like stone, immovable, undeniable. A murmur spread through the room, but this time it was not one of mockery or panic. It was one of acknowledgement. Investors exchanged glances heavy with new calculations. A woman at the far end whispered to her companion, "She owns the room. She owns the future." The reply came as a grim, certain nod. "And she owns the deal that is now gone forever." At last, Serafina rose. The movement was slow, unhurried, yet it rippled through the hall like a silent thunder. The dark stains on her emerald dress glistened under the light, but they no longer looked like marks of shame. They looked like proof. Proof that even when drenched in cruelty, she could stand, untouchable. Chairs scraped as some guests instinctively rose with her, unsure whether it was respect or fear that moved them. The quartet, still silent, lowered their bows altogether, sensing that the night had passed far beyond the realm of music. She turned toward the exit. Her steps were measured, each one echoing in the profound silence. No one blocked her way. No one dared to speak. As she passed, the sea of wealthy and powerful guests shifted, parting before her like subjects before their sovereign. Just before reaching the doors, she paused. She looked back one last time, not at the empty space where Isabel Sterling had stood, not at the shattered glass left behind, but at the crowd itself. Her gaze swept over them, calm and resolute. "Power doesn't come from spectacle," she said, her voice clear and final. It comes from what happens after. And with that, she stepped through the doors, leaving behind a hall filled not with laughter, but with a deep and resounding awe. The guests remained frozen in her wake. The whispers, the frantic calls, the headlines, those would all come later. But for now, in the gilded room where a queen had been revealed, the silence said it all. She had entered the evening as a guest. She left it as the only name that would ever truly matter. True strength isn't about the noise you make, but the impact you leave behind. If you believe that, make sure you're subscribed for more stories that challenge the status quo. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded of what real power looks like. Thank you for being here.